Hello everyone, welcome to GS Booster Shot, your daily dose for GS preparations. In our today's lecture, we're going to cover up a very important topic with respect to international relations, and that is the China's new border law. We're going to do a critical evaluation of this very law with respect to India. This topic is important with respect to GS2, as I've already told you. The topics it relates to are India and its neighborhood, effect of policies and politics of countries on India's interests. At the cost of repetition, I'd say that in order to ace the examination, what is required is not enhancing our sources of information, but curtailing our sources of knowledge. You may write it down, we will not be having more than 300 valid issues over which we are required to develop perspective from the aspect of UPSC General Studies examination. So let us see what this law is and what are its implications. First of all, let us see the border disputes of China. Which all countries is China today having border disputes? China shares land boundary with about 14 countries. Out of these 14 countries, there are about only 2 countries with which it is left with border disputes. One is India and another is Bhutan. With Bhutan, China has recently entered into a 3-step agreement towards resolution of the border issue. How it is a concern for India, we'll see in furtherance of this very lecture. So, let us see what this law actually talks about. So, Article 1 of this very law actually talks about the delineation and demarcation of the land borders. Now, naturally, China is going to demarcate its borders as per its own understanding and as per its own acceptance. It is not taking into account, while demarcation of these borders, the disputes with its neighbors. Then, Article 4 stipulates that sovereignty and territorial integrity are sacred and inviolable and are indicative of a tougher stance taken by China. Naturally, with respect to any country's territory, the country would say that it is its sovereign right, and any country would not stand when another country violates its territorial integrity. So, it is a mere reiteration in written form of this very nature of a sovereign state. Now, this is a broad legislation because it just not deals with border security and development, but also deals with management and authorizes key agencies specific tasks. Now, as in case of India, we see that there is central forces which are guarding the borders, such as the BSF, and just in the similar manner in China, the provincial armed forces basically guard the borders. The PLA is the military, that is the army wing. However, the borders are guarded by the armed forces of the provinces of China, and therefore there has been an overlap of responsibilities between the PLA and the border forces of the provincial states, and this law basically actually clears this very air and this very lacuna in their administrative structure. Then Article 10 calls for strengthening border defense, supporting the economy and social development along the border regions, and improving public services and infrastructure. Basically, China, by this very law, has asked its provinces to do more developmental activities and economic activities in border areas and develop frontier villages. These villages would be set up along the borders. This would mark Chinese presence along the border, and naturally, since if the citizens start settling over there, it adds another protective layer to the security apparatus, and this is going to give a stronger legal framework and impetus for work related to border villages that have been built across Tibet as well. Tibet and along the disputed border of India with China with respect to Arunachal Pradesh also. Now, what are the deductions? What is the intelligentsia of our country? What are the experts saying with respect to this very law? So, over here we have views of 2 former ambassadors. One is Mr. Suresh K. Goyal. He opines that since protection of one's border and territorial integrity is the mandate of any sovereign nation, putting it down in pen does not really mean anything new. and therefore this law is more inward looking than outward looking. That is the opinion of Ambassador Suresh K. Goyal. Then Gautam Bambawale, former ambassador to Beijing and Thimphu, has told to the print that it is a lot of verbiage, it is a lot of hot air, it doesn't change the realities on the ground. So ये कह रहे हैं ये सिर्फ बातें हैं, बहुत सारी बस बोली गई हैं, इससे ग्राउंड रियलिटीज पे कोई फर्क नहीं आने वाला है. नाउ अगर हम चाइना की टैक्टिक्स का एनालिसिस करें विद रिस्पेक्ट टू वॉरफेयर, तो उससे तीन एस्पेक्ट समझ आते हैं. फर्स्ट एस्पेक्ट इज विद रिस्पेक्ट टू पब्लिक डिप्लोमेसी. सो पब्लिक डिप्लोमेसी ये वो एक्शंस होंगे जो कि गियर्ड होंगे चाइना के लिए इंटरनल बेसिकली अपने सिटीजन्स की तरफ अपनी एक इमेज बनाने के लिए सरकार के, कि व्हाट द गवर्नमेंट इज एक्चुअली डूइंग विद रिस्पेक्ट टू इट्स टेरिटरी एंड इट्स सॉवरेनिटी. देन it is psychological warfare. There would be certain actions, certain statements which generally come in, such as the general objection of any of the Indian visits, higher authority visits to Arunachal Pradesh, when China says that okay, it is not okay for the vice president to visit Arunachal Pradesh. It objects to visiting of high officials such as the army chief to Arunachal Pradesh. So it is part of general psychological warfare. Then the third is लीगल वॉरफेयर. सो लीगल वॉरफेयर से चाइना बेसिकली कुछ एक लॉज लेके आता है जिससे वह अपने जो एक्शंस हैं, यूनिलैटरल एक्शंस हैं, उनको जस्टिफाई करने की कोशिश करता है. इसका सबसे बड़ा एग्जांपल है ताइवान. सो चाइना अपने ही लॉ लाके ये कहता है कि दैट ताइवान इज एन इंटीग्रल पार्ट ऑफ चाइना and therefore it tries to basically provide some legitimacy to its actions and to its statements. So if in future China does take any stance with respect to the disputed border with India, and if it wants to legitimize these very actions with respect to incursions in Indian border, or I would say line of actual control, so इसे इस तरीके से by means of this very law justify करने की कोशिश है. Then it is also going to help it develop or show a tougher stance with respect to our border disputes. The second and the most important deduction is with respect to the enhancement of power of Xi Jinping domestically. Now the other set of opinion says that by bringing in this very law, Xi Jinping is actually trying to consolidate his power in the provincial areas. So as I've already told you that the armed forces of the provinces basically man the border of China. Now by means of this very law, it states that now the armed forces will have to work in tandem with PLA, that is People's Liberation Army of China, which comes directly under Xi Jinping's authority. So in this very manner, some sort of control is going to be exerted on the workings of the armed forces of the provinces. These armed forces are having much higher reach in the border areas vis-a-vis what PLA has, and therefore it is in a manner to exert or bring in, basically rope in the provinces and increase the influence of Xi Jinping, the supreme leader, upon the provinces. Then what are the other factors with respect to this very China's move of bringing in this very law? Is the border dispute with India and only the triggering factor, or there are other things also which serve the basically outcomes of this very law? So basically China has emerging problems at three other sectors. One is with respect to in the Xinjiang province. So we already know that Taliban has come in power in Afghanistan, and this could have implications over the Uyghur Chinese conflict in Xinjiang province. So that in future the Uyghur infiltration and insurgency do not take ground and do not get support from across border areas by Taliban or any such extremist forces, it was very important to streamline for China the management of the borders and to increase further infrastructure and develop these frontier villages. If there would be frontier villages in the Xinjiang province as well, along the border to Afghanistan, then also it is going to help China into keeping a check over the Uyghur insurgency. Then there is the possibility of infiltration along the Indo-Tibetan border. Why is that so? Because we know that the succession to 14th Dalai Lama can happen any time. So Dalai Lama has come of age now, and there is all probability that a new Dalai Lama is to be elected or appointed. Now China is trying to exert its influence and wants to appoint this Dalai Lama itself, whereas the exiled government of Tibet is wanting to appoint their Dalai Lama. So in this very garb, it is also being felt that there is all possibility, when the time for this succession comes up, that there would be infiltration of the refugees, the Tibetan refugees, into China. Besides this, there is rising concern in the Tibetan community with respect to Sinicization of Tibet. Basically, China is bringing Han Chinese in these very areas, its most important ethnic group, the majority ethnic group, and having them settle down in Tibet. So there are concerns over Sinicization of Tibet amongst the refugees as well. So this is increasing the possibility of infiltration along the Indo-Tibet border as well, which again makes it important for setting down the stage of management of these very borders and development for China. Lastly, there are concerns over the idea of Greater Mongolia. So जैसे कि हम जानते हैं that there is People's Republic of Mongolia, चाइना के अगर आप ऊपर नॉर्थवर्ड साइड में देखेंगे, so we have People's Republic of Mongolia. There is Inner Mongolia, which is part of China. Now there is an idea, a nationalist idea which goes on in Mongolia, although large part of it is now subdued, that there has to be a Greater Mongolia, which would include Inner Mongolia, which is part of China, and certain areas of Russia as well. Now, if these nationalist sentiments get traction, there is possibility of trouble in the Mongolian border as well. And although it may be a distant thing, but when it comes to nation and how they think, they cannot basically discredit or discard any such possibility. And therefore, if such a thing takes place, it would raise great strategic challenges for China once again. Therefore, these three are the other areas over which this very law is going to have impact and will help in curtailing these areas, these disputes. Now, let us see the earlier border agreements of India with China. So we are having roughly 5 pacts with China. This information would be important for you from the prelims aspect, since our border issues with China and how we are trying to resolve them are in the question of late since past 1.5 years. So we need to know as to what all were the arrangements that we had with China which are today not being respected. So these are: in 1993 we had the agreement on maintenance of peace and tranquility along the line of actual control in Indo-China border areas. 1996 में एक और agreement हुआ on confidence building measures in military field along the LAC. इसके अंदर basically military leaders अपनी continuously over a periodic time will get into meetings and resolve whatever disputes which might be occurring. Then in 2005 we had the protocol on modalities for the implementation of confidence building measures in military field along the LOC, a corollary of this very 1996 agreement. In 2012, we had the agreement on the establishment of a working mechanism for consultation and coordination on India-China border affairs. And in 2013, we had the Border Defense Cooperation Agreement. This was by far the most important agreement that we had before our ongoing standoff on border with China. Now, for India, what are the chief concerns which are emerging from this very law? Let us have a look for this. So, as I've already told you, that the law calls for provincial states of China to develop frontier villages in the border areas. Now, many of these villages are in disturbed border areas or disputed border areas on what we consider as our own side. And China is actually trying to develop infrastructure and communication facilities, enhanced infrastructure and communication facilities along these very areas. Now, with respect to India, we started developing our border infrastructure only about 6 to 7 years back, whereas China has been doing this since 1941. There had been reluctance at Delhi to develop these very border infrastructure so that there is no irking of China. However, with the enhanced Chinese stance and the exertion by China of its power on the international stage, which started in the second decade of 21st century, India realized that now it cannot let go of this very area and started developing its infrastructure. This had been a key irking point with China and has been also attributed as one of the reasons why China has become so aggressive on the border lately. However, if we are to consider our infrastructure vis-a-vis China, we are not at that very good stage, at the stage which China is. There are many areas which lack communication facilities and many areas which do not even have motorable roads. Another very reason for this is also that when China constructs or does infrastructure development in the Tibetan plateau, you see Tibetan plateau is entirely flat, whereas when we develop infrastructure, we have to develop it in mountainous region. Although there has been extreme push given to infrastructure development, however, it is still going to take time. So this is why it is concerned, the infrastructure development, the development of frontier villages is a concern for us. Now, since the mandate now has been given to the provinces to develop these areas, now this means that there is possibility now that we will come in direct argument or confrontation with the provincial governments of China. Now, does this mean that now we have to interact with the provincial governments also? Earlier on, we have already been always, this is how it happens, that the central authority of the country interacts with the other central authority. So till now, whenever there was any dispute or concern, the issues were raised with respect to the same with the center in China. However, with provinces given enhanced mandate to develop infrastructure along the border areas, now if we come in any disagreement with the same development, do we now have to interact with the provinces? It raises new concern. Then the law naturally signals a greater PLA activity along the border in future. Now naturally China has given this a legislative imprint, which means that it is now more proactively take actions along the border in future. So we cannot discredit this very possibility that in future that there might be new disputes in our Arunachal Pradesh sector or Tibetan sector as well. Then Article 15 of this very law is very peculiar. Why do I say it is peculiar? Because it calls for principles of equality and calls for negotiations in case of border disputes. Now, it says that in case there are any border disputes, it will be resolved on the principles of equality and would have to be dealt with in a normal manner. However, if we are to see, we had these 5 agreements earlier and still China has not respected these agreements and has taken an aggressive stand, rather militarily done incursions in the so-called line of actual control. And despite of over 13 rounds of talks between both the military sides, we haven't come to any resolution and the issue is still at an impasse. So therefore, it appears that this very part of treating any border disputes with principles of equality and resorting to negotiations is just on paper and China does not actually mean it. Then lastly, China has recently entered in a 3-step agreement with Bhutan for border dispute resolution. Now, the details of this very agreement are not being made public. We don't know because Bhutan does talks or liaises through China, through India, liaises with China through India because they are not having direct diplomatic actions. There is a possibility that maybe the Indian side in the internal sphere might have knowledge of it. However, we have to state what is in public. So as of now, there is nothing public. The Indian government side has not admitted that they know about what these agreement is and what are these 3 steps. So with China now trying to basically, or China and Bhutan entering into this resolution, memorandum of understanding for the purpose of resolution, it also raises concerns for India, because the concern with India is that if the exchange that China has actually proposed with Bhutan, China has asked that Bhutan may give the Doklam Plateau area to it in exchange of some other territory. If China actually gets that very territory, this would bring China in more proximity to our Siliguri corridor, which we also call as the chicken neck corridor, and therefore it is also an area of concern. Now, lastly, with respect to any issue, we need to have a way forward also. Over here, we can only basically develop our capacities and keep a close eye on what China is doing. Since in international relations, such unilateral laws seldom have more value. It is generally more as pressure tactics and used as signaling to our one's inner population. However, let us see what all actions we can write down in our GS examination if we are being asked with way forward. First of all, seeing the increased aggressive nature and the probability of any future actions to be taken by PLA along the borders, there is need of enhanced surveillance across all border areas. This includes Tibet and rather areas which are in close proximity to areas over which China is having direct control. Then there is need for greater push for development of border infra as well and communication facilities. So the infrastructure and communication facilities even in Ladakh are not up to date, and when compared with China, our infrastructure development is at very nascent stage. Even with respect to communication as well, there is not very much penetration of Wi-Fi network also over there, broadband network. So there is need for development of these communication facilities. At times of dispute, in past conflicts, we have realized that it is a local population which is provided crucial intelligence whenever an incursion is being taken place. Only the army cannot actually put a gaze over the entire area. So therefore, development of local population is also very necessary. So what can be done is that there is need of engagement of small and medium enterprises. As we know that BRO, Border Road Organization, does all the development along the border areas. However, if local population is actually engaged in these development activities, small and medium enterprises, local chambers of commerce are basically engaged in these very activities of development of infrastructure along the border. Not only it is going to provide prosperity to these very areas, these very people who are living at the border areas, it is also going to give them another impetus to stay over there, and this would help in maintaining our presence along the border areas. So this is all with respect to today's lecture and with respect to this very topic. Should you have any doubt with respect to this topic, you feel free to put your doubts in the comment section. I'd be more than happy to reply them. I am also attaching the PDF of this very slides along with this lecture. Thank you and have a nice day.